Look at the cup in your hand. It seems innocent enough. A delicate vessel of bone china resting on a lace tablecloth, the steam rising in lazy, comforting swirls. You are about to partake in the most quintessential of British rituals. You have been told that this liquid is a restorative tonic, a civilized pause in the chaos of the industrial world. It smells faintly floral, perhaps a little earthy. But if you knew what was actually floating in that hot water, dissolving into the liquid you are about to swallow, you would not just put the cup down, you would throw it into the fire. Forget the grand feasts you have seen in movies. Tonight, we are not discussing food as sustenance, but food as a chemistry experiment gone wrong. The liquid you are sipping is not tea. It is likely a slurry of floor sweepings, industrial dyes, and dried leaves stripped from the local hedgerow. It might contain sheep's dung for texture, or iron filings for weight. It is a grim affair, disguised as luxury. They called it the slow death, and for good reason. You are not going to die instantly. This is not a dramatic poisoning where you clutch your throat and collapse before the dessert course. It is much more insidious than that. It is a gradual accumulation of heavy metals in your liver and your brain. It is the trembling in your hands that you cannot explain, the sudden bouts of hypochondriasis and gloom. It is the strange metallic taste that lingers at the back of your throat long after the cup is empty. You think it is just your nerves jangling from the caffeine. The bad news is, it is actually the lead and the copper eating away at your nervous system, one sip at a time. We are going to walk through the logistics of this fraud. We are going to trace the journey of these leaves, if they are indeed leaves, from the humid Godowns on the banks of the Pearl River in Canton to the final, fatal sip. We will look at the economics that made poisoning the population a mathematical necessity. We will examine the tax laws that turned sawdust into gold. This was not a mistake. This was a global trade empire built on a foundation of sand, dirt, and deception. So, push the lace doily aside. Forget the polite conversation. We need to leave the comfort of the parlour and go to where the rot begins. To understand why your daily ritual is killing you, we have to travel back to the source. We have to look at the money. Because before the poison ever touched your lips, it started as a line item on a ledger. To understand the poison, you must first understand the price. In the 19th century, tea was not merely a dried leaf packed in a crate. It was the liquid currency of the British Empire. It was a revenue stream so vast and so reliable that the government became addicted to it long before the population did. There is a cynical truth to the history of food. Safety is almost always secondary to solvency. And in this era, the solvency of the crown depended on every single cup you brewed. The demand was voracious. It had ceased to be a luxury for the aristocracy and had become a necessity for the shivering masses. For the factory worker in Manchester or the seamstress in London, a hot cup of tea was often the only source of warmth in a damp, unheated room. It was a comfort, a stimulant, and a tragic substitute for actual nutrition. When bread was scarce and meat was a distant memory, tea offered the illusion of a meal. It tricked the stomach and warmed the blood. But this desperation created a market that was ripe for exploitation. The poor needed tea, but they could not afford it. The barrier was the tax. For much of this period, the duty on tea was punishingly high, at times reaching over 100%. Think about the mathematics of that for a moment. For every pound of tea imported, the cost more than doubled before it even left the warehouse. This created a mathematical impossibility in the marketplace. The public demanded tea at a price that was physically lower than the cost of importing it legally. If you saw a sign in the grocer's window advertising tea at a bargain rate, you were not looking at a good deal. You were looking at a crime scene. This brings us to the grocer's dilemma. Imagine for a moment that you are a tea merchant in a bustling Victorian street. You are an honest man. You wish to sell pure, unadulterated Bohea or Hyson tea imported directly from the East India Company. You pay the import price, you pay the crushing tax, and you calculate your margin. You put your tea on the shelf at 5 shillings a pound. It is a fair price for an honest product. But down the street, your competitor is selling tea for 3 shillings. His shop is full, your shop is empty. The customers do not care about the provenance of the leaf. They care that they have 3 shillings in their pocket and a family to warm. If you persist in your honesty, you will go bankrupt within the month. If you wish to survive, you must find a way to lower your price below the cost of the raw materials. You have to cheat. It is not a choice born of malice, but of survival. You must find something, anything, to bulk out that expensive leaf. You realize that if you mix in 20% of something else, something free, you can lower your price. If you mix in 50%, you can undercut everyone. The logic of the market dictates that the most adulterated product wins. The government knew this. They saw the revenue coming in and chose to look the other way. As long as the duty was paid on the portion that was actually tea, the treasury was satisfied. The health of the public was a distant second to the health of the exchequer. But where does one find enough cheap filler to dilute a nation's supply of tea? You cannot simply use sawdust. The texture is wrong. You need something that looks like a leaf, curls like a leaf, and turns the water dark. To find the first layer of this deception, we cannot stay in the grocer's back room. We must go to the source. We must travel thousands of miles to the only place on earth where the tea plant grew, to a restricted port where the pressure to produce was breaking the system apart. To find the origin of the deception, we must leave the grey, rain-slicked streets of London and travel thousands of miles to the humid, sweltering banks of the Pearl River. Welcome to Canton. In the 19th century, this was not merely a port, it was the single, suffocating bottleneck of the entire global tea trade. For decades, this was the only legal gateway between the vast tea gardens of China and the thirsty teapots of the West. If you were a British merchant, you could not simply wander into the Chinese interior to buy your goods. You were confined to a tiny strip of land on the waterfront, known as the 13 Factories. It was a golden cage, a place of immense wealth and claustrophobic restriction, where the air hung heavy with moisture and the smell of money. The entire system relied on a choke point, standing between the foreign ships anchored at Whampoa and the tea growers in the distant mountains, was a small, exclusive guild of Chinese merchants known as the Hongs. These men were the gatekeepers. They were the only people legally permitted to trade with the foreign devils. Every single chest of tea that left China had to pass through their hands. They were fabulously wealthy, often ranking among the richest men in the world, but they existed in a precarious state of survival. They were squeezed from above by the imperial court, which demanded exorbitant taxes and bribes, and squeezed from below by the insatiable, screaming demand of the British Empire. The logistics of this arrangement were a nightmare. The tea did not arrive in Canton ready to load. It had to travel hundreds of miles from the interior, carried by coolies over mountain passes, and floated down river systems on shallow barges. By the time it reached the Canton waterfront, it was exhausted, and then it stopped. It was unloaded into the Godowns. A godown is a warehouse, but that word implies a sterile, dry storage space. These were cavernous, dim structures built of wood and brick, sitting directly on the riverbank. The air inside was not climate-controlled. It was a living thing. The humidity in Canton is relentless, a thick, wet blanket that clings to your skin and seeps into everything. Inside the godowns, the air was stagnant and heavy. The tea chest sat there, sometimes for months, waiting for the trading season to open, waiting for the ships to arrive, waiting for the deals to be struck. In this darkness, the tea began to change. Tea is hygroscopic. It loves water. It pulls moisture from the air like a sponge. As the chest sat in the Godowns, absorbing the damp exhalations of the river, the leaves would soften. They would lose their crispness. They would begin to smell not just of tea, but of the warehouse itself, a mixture of wet timber, straw matting, and the faint, sweet rot of the river mud. This was the Canton flavour that British drinkers eventually came to associate with quality, unaware that they were tasting the early stages of decay. But the real danger in the Godowns was not the damp, it was the desperation. The British East India Company, and later the private traders, came with orders that defied the laws of agriculture. They wanted millions of pounds of tea, and they wanted it at a specific price point. The Hong merchants knew that the harvest was finite. There were only so many tea bushes in the Anhui or Fujian provinces. But you did not tell the British Empire no. If a Hong merchant failed to fulfill his quota, he faced bankruptcy, exile, or worse. The pressure was absolute. So, the logic of the market took over. If you cannot find enough high-quality leaves to fill the chests, you must lower your standards. You mix the harvest. You take the old, stale leaves from last year's unsold stock, leaves that have been sitting in the damp for 12 months, and you blend them with the fresh crop. You sweep the warehouse floor. You look at the tea dust, the broken twigs, and the grit that has accumulated in the corners, and you realize that with a little bit of effort, this refuse can be monetized. The Godowns ceased to be just a storage facility. It became a laboratory. The tea was not just being packed here, it was being improved. This brings us to a practice known in the trade as facing. It is a polite, almost cosmetic term, implying a gentle touch-up, perhaps a little polish to improve the appearance of the product. In reality, it was industrial forgery. It was the systematic application of chemical dyes to a foodstuff, designed solely to deceive the eye of the buyer at the expense of their internal organs. And the root of this deception lay not in Chinese malice, but in British ignorance. There was a fundamental misunderstanding of botany among the British consumers sitting in their parlours in London or Manchester. They had a romanticised vision of the East, fueled by porcelain patterns and travelogues. They believed that a fresh green tea leaf, once plucked and dried, should retain the vibrant, snapping emerald colour of the living plant. They wanted their tea to look like a jewel in the caddy. The reality, of course, is that when you dry a green leaf, it dies. It fades. It turns a dull olive green, perhaps even a yellowish brown. It looks, for lack of a better word, dead. But the British public did not want dead leaves. They associated that dull colour with age, with staleness, with a product that had lost its potency. They demanded brightness. The Chinese merchants, being pragmatic businessmen, understood this dynamic perfectly. If the foreign devils refused to buy the natural leaf because it looked too dull, they would simply make it brighter. If nature could not provide that electric green hue, they would turn to the paint pot. They would give the customer exactly what they wanted, even if it killed them. The recipe for this illusion was a toxic cocktail that would be more at home in an artist's studio than a kitchen. The primary ingredient used to achieve that deep, rich green was Prussian blue. This is not a food colouring. It is ferrocyanide of iron. It is a synthetic pigment, celebrated in the art world for its intense, moody depth, used to paint storm clouds or the uniforms of soldiers. It has no business being anywhere near a teapot, but it provided the dark, cool base notes of the colour. To get the lighter, fresher, greener highlights, they mixed this blue poison with turmeric, a yellow root. It was the colour theory of the kindergarten classroom applied to the food supply of an empire. Blue mixed with yellow makes green, but a dry powder does not stick easily to a dry, crinkled leaf. If you just dusted it on, it would fall off in the chest. They needed a binding agent, something to make the pigment adhere and to give the leaf a sleek, glossy finish that would catch the light. For this, they used gypsum. sulfate of lime. It is the same material used to make plaster of Paris or drywall. It is gritty, it is heavy, and it is incredibly cheap. The application of this poison was a visceral, physical labor. Picture the scene in the Canton warehouse. The tea leaves are placed in large, cast iron roasting pans over a charcoal fire. The heat is intense, necessary to dry the leaves, but also to make them receptive to the dye. The worker stands over the hot pan, his face slick with sweat in the stifling humidity of the riverfront. He takes a handful of the blue gypsum powder, a fine, chalky dust, and scatters it over the roasting leaves. Then, he plunges his bare hands into the mixture. He rubs the leaves against the hot iron, rolling them, compressing them, forcing the toxic dust into the very pores and fibers of the plant. His hands would be stained a deep, indelible blue, the dye working its way into his own skin, just as it worked into the tea. He stirs and rubs until every single leaf is coated, until the dull olive color is entirely masked by a vibrant, artificial emerald sheen. It was a transformation. The tea looked fresh. It looked expensive. It looked exactly like the lie the British consumer wanted to believe. This was particularly aggressive with the variety known as gunpowder tea. These are leaves rolled into tight, hard little pellets that resemble lead shot. To get that tight seal, to make the pellets smooth and shiny, the worker had to work the gypsum paste into the ball with significant force. It was like rolling pills of clay. The result was a product that felt heavy in the hand, a satisfying weight that the consumer mistook for the density of the leaf, when in reality they were feeling the weight of the stone dust packed inside it. The quantities involved were not trivial. In 1844, Robert Warrington of the Chemical Society tested samples of green tea and found that 100% of them were faced with Prussian blue and gypsum. You were paying for tea, but you were buying plaster and paint. The irony is sharp. The more expensive the tea, the more beautiful it looked, which meant the more poison it contained. The cheap tea might just be old, but the luxury tea was painted. You were paying a premium for the privilege of ingesting ferrocyanide. Once the leaves had been roasted, rolled, and painted with their coat of Prussian blue, they were ready for the final stage of their captivity. They were not simply poured into sacks. A sack is porous. A sack breathes. If you put tea in a sack and threw it into the hold of a ship, it would be a rotting compost heap before it reached the Cape of Good Hope. The tea needed armor. It needed a container that could withstand 6 months of salt spray, bilge fumes, and the gnawing teeth of ship rats. It needed the tea chest. You have likely seen these chests in museums or antique shops, repurposed as charming coffee tables. They are sturdy wooden boxes, often decorated with Chinese characters and exotic stamps. But in the 19th century, they were strictly utilitarian shipping containers. And like everything else in this story, their construction was a negotiation between preservation and poison. The wood itself was usually a cheap, local timber, perhaps pine or camphor, roughly hewn and nailed together. But wood is not waterproof. To seal the chest, the interior was lined with a specific material that became the silent killer of the Victorian tea drinker: lead foil. It was a brilliant logistical solution. Lead is soft, malleable, and impermeable. You can roll it into sheets as thin as paper. You can fold it into the corners of a wooden box to create a perfectly airtight, watertight metal skin. It kept the humidity of the ocean out, and it kept the aroma of the tea in. It was the 19th century equivalent of vacuum packing. But there was a flaw in the design. The lead lining was in direct contact with the tea. There was no plastic barrier, no wax paper interface. The painted leaves, already coated in gypsum and ferrocyanide, were pressed directly against the grey, dull metal. Over the course of a long voyage, a ship does not sit still. It rolls, it pitches, the cargo shifts. For months on end, The tea leaves would vibrate against the lead lining. This constant, microscopic friction acted like sandpaper. It ground minute particles of the lead foil into dust, which then mingled with the tea dust at the bottom of the chest. When you bought a chest-bottom bargain in London, you were essentially spooning heavy metal filings into your teapot. But the tea did not just fall into the chest. It had to be forced. Space on a clipper ship was the most expensive real estate in the world. You did not ship air. You had to pack as much product as physically possible into every cubic inch of the hold. To achieve the necessary density, the tea had to be compressed, and the machine used for this compression was the human body. The packing process was a visceral, sweaty reality. A worker, usually barefoot and stripped to the waist to cope with the stifling heat of the warehouse, would climb inside the chest. As the fresh, painted leaves were poured in around him, he would begin a rhythmic, heavy stomp. He was a human piston. He would trample the leaves down, using his full body weight to crush the air out of the mix, packing the tea into a solid, brick-like mass. Consider the hygiene of this for a moment. This was physical labor in a tropical climate. There were no sanitary protocols. The sweat from the worker's body, the dirt from his bare feet, and whatever debris was on the floor of the godown all became part of the blend. He stomped and pressed until the chest was full, layer by hard-packed layer. Then, the lead foil was folded over the top, soldered shut with a hot iron, and the wooden lid was nailed down. This aggressive packing was necessary not just for the sea voyage, but for the brutal overland journey that preceded it. Before the tea even reached the Canton Godowns to be painted and packed, it had already travelled hundreds of miles. The primary route for green tea involved a trek from the Anhui Mountains, carried on the backs of porters, to the tributaries of Poyang Lake. From there, it was loaded onto shallow riverboats that navigated the treacherous rapids and sandbars of the river systems leading south. It was a journey of months, exposed to rain, sun, and river mist. The chests had to be robust enough to survive being dropped, dragged, and stacked on wet decks. The lead lining was the only thing standing between the harvest and the elements. It was a tragic irony of the trade. The very measure taken to preserve the tea's quality was the primary vehicle for its toxicity. The lead saved the leaf from rot, only to deliver a different kind of decay to the drinker. The chest was now a sealed capsule of chemicals, sweat and metal, waiting for the cranes to hoist it into the dark belly of a ship. The crane lifts the chest from the humid dockside and lowers it into the dark, gaping maw of the ship. The hatch is battened down, the tarpaulins are secured, and the tea begins its real journey. You might imagine this voyage as a romantic affair, white sails billowing against a blue sky, the clipper ship cutting cleanly through the waves. But for the cargo, the reality was not a maritime adventure. It was a prison sentence. The journey from the Pearl River to the London docks was a voyage of 15,000 miles, tracing a line across the Indian Ocean, around the treacherous Cape of Good Hope, and up through the churning grey of the Atlantic. It took anywhere from 4 to 6 months, and for every minute of that half year, the tea was locked in a sensory nightmare. Consider the environment of the cargo hold. This was not a sterile shipping container. It was a wooden cavern located below the waterline, where the air never changed. Once the ship left Canton, that hold was sealed. The air inside was the same air that had been trapped on the humid Chinese riverfront, now stagnating in the dark. There was no ventilation. To open the hatches at sea was to risk flooding the ship, so the atmosphere inside simply thickened, turning into a heavy, suffocating miasma that clung to the beams and the boxes. The tea was rarely travelling alone. A ship's captain, driven by the same economic hunger as the grocer, would pack every available inch of space with merchandise. The tea chests were often stacked alongside other commodities of the East: bales of raw silk, crates of porcelain, and sacks of spices. But there were more pungent neighbours. Medicinal rhubarb was a common export, a root with a strong, earthy, slightly medicinal odour. Camphor, with its piercing mothball scent, was another. Even opium, though usually flowing the other way, sometimes left its ghostly, sickly sweet residue in the timbers of the ship. In this confined, airless space, a war of smells took place. Tea is a delicate botanical. It breathes. Despite the lead lining, despite the wood, it has a tendency to absorb the character of its environment. For months, the tea sat in the dark, inhaling the scent of rhubarb, the musk of raw silk, and the sharp tang of camphor. It was marinating in the odours of the hold. But the most pervasive smell, the one that no amount of lead foil could truly keep out, was the smell of the ship itself. A wooden ship is held together by tar and oakum. The smell of pitch, that sharp, chemical, resinous scent, is the background radiation of maritime life. In the heat of the tropics, as the ship crossed the equator, the tar in the deck seams would melt and bubble. The fumes would drift down into the hold, settling on the chests like a fine, invisible dust. The tea began to taste less like a leaf and more like the vessel that carried it. But the heat brought a worse enemy, the sweat. As the ship sailed from the sweltering heat of the Indian Ocean into the frigid gales of the South Atlantic, the temperature in the hold would swing violently. The warm, humid air trapped inside the ship would hit the cold timber of the hull, cooled by the freezing ocean outside. The result was condensation on an industrial scale. The ship would literally sweat. Water would drip from the deck beams, running down the sides of the hull, pooling on the floorboards. This was not clean rainwater. It was the condensed breath of the cargo, a stagnant, tepid moisture that created a perfect breeding ground for mould. And then there was the water coming from below. Every wooden ship leaks. It is a fact of naval architecture. Water seeps in through the seams, through the rudder casing, through the microscopic gaps in the planking. This water collects in the very bottom of the ship, in the bilge. This is not the clean, salty ocean. The bilge is a soup. It is a mixture of seawater, sewage from the crew, dead rats, rotting food scraps, and whatever leakage has trickled down from the cargo. It is a foul, anaerobic sludge that sloshes back and forth with every roll of the ship, releasing bubbles of hydrogen sulfide and methane. The tea chests were stacked just above this fetid swamp. For months, the fumes from the bilge would rise up through the floorboards of the hold, permeating the wood of the chests. If a storm struck and the ship took on too much water, the bilge levels would rise and the bottom layer of tea chests would be soaking in this toxic bath. Even if they stayed dry, they were fumigated by the stench of rot for half a year. By the time the ship finally navigated the English Channel and docked in the grey fog of London, the tea was exhausted. It was musty. It was faint. It had lost the grassy brightness of the fresh leaf and acquired the heavy, dull character of the hold. To the Victorian palate, this degradation became normalised. They came to expect tea to taste a little bit like tar and a little bit like mould. They mistook the flavour of the voyage for the flavour of the tea. But as the hatches were finally pried open and the light of London spilled into the hold, the real fraud was about to begin. Welcome to London. The journey of the tea has ended, but its ordeal is only shifting phases. Imagine standing on the quayside of the East India Docks on a grey, drizzly morning. The scale of what you are seeing is difficult to comprehend. By the 1830s, the East India Company was importing £30 million of tea annually. We are not talking about a few crates being unloaded by a couple of men. We are talking about an industrial avalanche. As the ships are unburdened, the tea chests are stacked into literal mountains on the wharf. They form a wooden skyline that rivals the buildings around them, a chaotic architecture of commerce that stretches as far as the eye can see through the fog. The air here is different from the humid rot of the ship's hold. It is sharp with the smell of coal smoke, the sulphuric stench of the Thames, and the raw, untreated sewage of a city bursting at the seams. And swarming over these mountains of tea are the agents of the Crown. This is the moment of inspection. But if you think these men are here to ensure your safety, you are gravely mistaken. The customs officer is not a guardian of public health. He is a guardian of the purse. His only tool is a scale, and his only interest is the ledger. He approaches a chest, perhaps one that has been soaking in bilge water for 3 months, or one that is vibrating with the heavy metal dust of its lead lining. He does not open it to check for mold. He does not take a sample to test for copper or arsenic. He simply weighs it. The British government in the 19th century was fueled by the tea tax. As long as the duty was paid, that crushing levy that made the tea so expensive in the first place, the officer was satisfied. The chest could contain pure poison as long as it was taxable poison. Once the bureaucracy was satisfied, the tea was moved into the bonded warehouse. This was the purgatory of the trade. These were vast, cavernous buildings, often cold and riddled with damp, where the tea would sit, sometimes for another year, waiting for a merchant to pay the duty and release it into the wild. Here, the tea continued to age. It sat in the dark, absorbing the specific flavour of London, the coal dust that hung in the air, the damp rising from the river, and the musty scent of the stone walls. But before it could be sold, it often underwent a process known as garbling. This sounds like a harsh word, and the reality was just as rough. Garbling was essentially the industrial sifting of the tea. The chests were broken open, and the contents were passed through great sieves. The goal was to separate the whole leaves, the quality product, from the broken fragments and the dust that had accumulated during the voyage. In a sane world, this dust would be discarded. It was the refuse of the trade, a mixture of pulverized leaves, lead filings, dirt from the warehouse floor, and whatever splinters had come off the chest. But in the Victorian tea trade, nothing was wasted. This dust was swept up with religious care. It was not thrown into the Thames. It was bagged, labelled, and sold. This tea dust was the raw material for the next stage of the fraud. It was the base ingredient for the cheap tea sold to the poor. But dust alone does not look like tea. To make it sellable, it had to be resurrected. It had to be glued back together. And for that, it needed to leave the official world of the bonded warehouse and enter the shadow economy of the London backstreets. We have spent a great deal of time looking at the sins of the Chinese merchant and the negligence of the British customs officer. But it would be unfair and historically inaccurate to lay the blame entirely at the feet of the foreign trade. The British have always been an industrious people, and when it came to the poisoning of the national beverage, they were not content to let the world leave them behind. They developed a homegrown industry of fraud that rivaled anything coming out of Canton. They called it smooch. It is an ugly word for an ugly practice. Smooch was the Victorian trade slang for a product that looked like tea, broke like tea, and darkened the water like tea, but had never seen the inside of a tea garden. It was the result of a massive, organised botanical heist carried out across the English countryside. While you sat in your parlour imagining your tea leaves being plucked by exotic maidens in the misty hills of Fujian, the reality was far more mundane and far closer to home. The leaves in your cup were likely stripped from a tree in a muddy ditch just outside of London. The demand for tea was so high and the tax so punitive that it created a vacuum in the market. There was simply not enough genuine tea arriving in the docks to feed the teapots of the working class at a price they could afford. Nature, as they say, abhors a vacuum, and the fraudster abhors a missed profit. So, a new supply chain was invented. It did not rely on the monsoon winds or the East India Company. It relied on the local flora. The raw materials for smouch were the trees and shrubs of the English hedgerow. The ash tree was a particular favourite. Its leaves are compound, meaning they are made up of smaller leaflets that, when dried and crushed, bear a passing resemblance to the tea leaf. But the ash was not alone. The slowbush, the elder, the hawthorn, and the willow were all conscripted into the tea trade. Even the humble elm and the plane tree were stripped bare. This was not a cottage industry where a rogue grocer dried a few leaves in his back oven. This was industrial-scale agriculture. A pamphlet by Twinings in 1785 estimated that 20 tons of this smooch were produced annually in just one small area of England. There were gangs of collectors, often women and children from the poorest classes, who were paid a pittance to scour the countryside. They would move through the hedgerows like locusts, stripping the branches of every green thing they could find. The leaves were stuffed into sacks and carted into the city, not to be used as mulch or animal feed, but to be transformed into your breakfast. Once the sacks arrived in London, they were taken to clandestine smooch factories. These were often located in the labyrinthine slums of the city, hidden away in cellars or behind the facades of legitimate businesses. Inside, the air would be thick with the smell of scorching vegetation. The process of turning a fresh green ash leaf into a dry black tea leaf was a violent acceleration of nature. The leaves were first boiled. This was necessary to soften them, to break down the cellular structure so they could be manipulated. But it was also necessary to remove the green taste. Ash and elder leaves are bitter, astringent, and grassy. By boiling them, sometimes with added chemicals like baking soda, the manufacturers could leach out the natural sap and flavour, leaving behind a neutral, leafy pulp. They were effectively killing the leaf so they could resurrect it as something else. After boiling, the soggy mass was drained and placed on large copper sheets or iron trays. These were heated over coal fires. This was the baking phase. The leaves had to be dried until they were crisp, until they curled up and turned brittle. The goal was to mimic the twist of a genuine tea leaf. Workers would rub the drying leaves between their hands or against the rough surface of the baking tray, forcing them to curl into tight, convincing little scrolls. But there was a problem: colour. An ash leaf, even when dried, tends to be a dull brown or a pale olive. It does not look like the deep, rich black of a fermented bohea tea. So, the smouch had to be dyed. The factories would use whatever was at hand. Logwood, a natural dye that produces a dark, reddish-black hue, was common. But often, they would simply scorch the leaves, burning them slightly to achieve that desired charcoal colour. The economics of smouch were irresistible. To produce a pound of this fake tea cost perhaps 4p. This covered the labour of the collectors, the coal for the fires, and the rent of the cellar. Genuine tea, once the duty was paid, cost 5 or 6 shillings a pound. The math is stark. A dishonest merchant could mix this smouch with genuine tea at a ratio of 1:3, or even 1:1, and instantly double his profit margin, while still undercutting his honest competitor down the street. The result was a product that defied the senses. When you brewed a cup of tea laced with smouch, you were drinking a tea that was legally and botanically a lie. It tasted sharp, it tasted woody, it lacked the complex, floral aroma of the Camellia sinensis. It had a biting quality that caught in the back of the throat, a roughness that no amount of milk or sugar could truly mask. But the Victorian consumer, beaten down by poverty and accustomed to the harsh flavours of an industrial diet, drank it anyway. They assumed the bitterness was a sign of strength. They did not know they were drinking a brew of boiled willow and scorched ash. And the tragedy is, this was the safe fraud. Because at least the ash leaf was a leaf, As we are about to see, the industry was perfectly willing to dispense with nature altogether. If the smooch industry was a botanical fraud, a lie told with the wrong kind of leaf, then what we must discuss next is a geological fraud. We are leaving the world of agriculture entirely and entering the realm of masonry. Because while the ash and the sloe were at least organic matter that had once photosynthesized in the sun, there was a product on the market that contained no whole leaves at all. It was known, with a rare and brutal honesty in the trade ledgers, as lie tea. The term was not a slur invented by angry British journalists. It was the literal translation of the Chinese name for the product. The merchants in Canton knew exactly what they were selling, and the brokers in London knew exactly what they were buying. It was a product designed to exploit a specific gap in the consumer's knowledge: the belief that tea, by definition, must be a leaf. Lie tea proved that tea could be a sculpture. To understand how this worked, you have to look at the bottom of the barrel. In every warehouse, in every ship's hold, and on every grocer's counter, the handling of tea creates waste. Leaves are brittle, they shatter, they turn into dust. In a legitimate trade, this dust is refuse. It is swept up and discarded. But in the Victorian tea trade, this dust was the primary ingredient for a new kind of alchemy. The Lie Tea Factory was not a place of drying racks and roasting pans. It was a place of mixing bowls and mortars. The manufacturer would take this accumulated dust, the sweepings of the godown, the dregs of the chest, and place it in a large vessel. But dust, on its own, is light. It floats. It does not have the satisfying heft that a customer associates with a high-quality grain of tea. To solve this, the manufacturer added the second ingredient: sand. Sand is heavy, it is cheap, and if you use a fine enough grain, it disappears into the mix. But sometimes, even sand was not enough. There are reports of iron filings being used, or just common dirt from the road. The goal was to create a mixture that was roughly 50% organic refuse and 50% mineral weight. When you bought a pound of this tea, you were buying 8 ounces of actual tea dust and 8 ounces of the local geology. But you cannot sell a bag of sand and dust to a housewife. It looks like potting soil. It needs to be structured. It needs to be built. This is where the binding agent came in. The workers would create a thick, glutinous paste. In China, this was often made from boiled rice water, a heavy, starchy glue. In London, it might be flour and water, or a gum solution. They would pour this sticky liquid into the trough with the dust and the sand, and they would begin to mix. Imagine the texture of this. It is a grey, gritty mud. It is a sludge. The worker plunges his hands into it, turning it over, ensuring that the starch thoroughly coats every grain of sand and every speck of tea dust. It is less like cooking and more like mixing concrete. Once the consistency was right, stiff, tacky, and moldable, the rolling began. The target was to mimic gunpowder tea. Genuine gunpowder tea is a green tea leaf that has been skillfully rolled by hand into a tight, small pellet. It is prized because the tight roll preserves the flavour. Lie tea mimicked this shape perfectly. The workers would take pinches of the grey mud and roll them between their fingers and thumbs. They would ball the sludge into thousands of tiny, perfect spheres. This was a tactile deception. The starch acted as the cement. As the pellet was rolled, the tea dust would adhere to the outside, concealing the sand in the centre. It was a microscopic geode, a core of grit wrapped in a thin veneer of tea. But at this stage, the pellets were soft. If you squeezed them, they would squash back into mud. To finalise the fraud, they had to be fired. The pellets were placed on iron trays and baked over charcoal fires. The heat evaporated the water in the starch paste, hardening the glue. The result was a pellet that was rock hard. You could drop it on a table and it would make a sharp clicking sound, just like a dried leaf. It felt dense. It felt substantial. It resisted the pressure of your fingers. To the untrained eye and the uncritical hand, it was a beautiful sample of gunpowder tea. The tragedy of lye tea was revealed only in the cup. When you pour hot water over a genuine rolled tea leaf, the magic of botany happens. The leaf rehydrates. It softens. It slowly unfurls, expanding to 3 or 4 times its dry size, revealing the serrated edges and the veins of the plant. It is a resurrection. When you pour hot water over lye tea, something very different happens. The hot water attacks the starch binder. The glue dissolves. The pellet does not unfurl. It disintegrates. It collapses back into its constituent parts. The sand, being heavy, drops instantly to the bottom of the cup, forming a gritty sediment. The tea dust floats to the top, forming a scum, and the water turns a murky, opaque color, clouded by the dissolved flour or rice starch. You were not drinking an infusion of herbs. You were drinking hot, dirty starch water seasoned with floor sweepings. And as you reached the bottom of the cup, the tea would grit between your teeth. That crunch was the sound of the fraud. It was the silica and the stone that you had paid 5 shillings a pound to ingest. But even this grit needed to be held together by something. The starch was the glue, but the ingredients themselves often came from an even darker source than the floor. To understand the full cycle of this economy, we have to look at how the tea industry cannibalized itself. We have dealt with the botanical fraud of the hedgerow and the geological fraud of the sand pellet. But there is a third category of deception that is perhaps the most psychologically disturbing of them all. It is not a matter of using the wrong leaf or no leaf at all. It is a matter of using the right leaf, but using it too many times. We are entering the economy of the exhausted tea leaf. This is the trade of the zombie ingredient, a product that has already lived, died, and been resurrected for a second grim life in your cup. To understand this, you have to look at the sheer volume of organic waste produced by a tea-obsessed nation. In the grand hotels of London, the bustling coffee houses of Fleet Street, and the great aristocratic townhouses of Mayfair, tea was brewed by the gallon. Every single day, millions of pounds of wet, soggy, spent tea leaves were generated. In a rational world, this would be compost. It would be thrown onto the garden or fed to the pigs. But in the Victorian economy, where a single pound of tea represented a significant percentage of a working man's weekly wage, throwing it away felt like burning money. So, a secondary market emerged. It began in the scullery. For the scullery maid, the charwoman, or the hotel kitchen porter, the used tea leaves were not garbage. They were a perquisite, a traditional perk of the job, like the drippings from the roast beef or the ends of the candles. It was their right to claim the dregs. Picture the reality of this collection. Throughout the day, as the teapots of the wealthy were emptied, the wet leaves were dumped into a designated bucket or a corner of the sink. They sat there, a sodden brown mound, slowly cooling and beginning to ferment. They were mixed with whatever else was in the sink, bits of food, grease, the washings of other plates. It did not matter. At the end of the day, the maid would scoop this sludge into a sack or an old apron. She was not keeping it for herself. She was waiting for the collector. These were men who roamed the back streets and service alleys of London, specifically looking to buy this refuse. The transaction was quick and illicit. The collector would pay the maid a few pence per pound for her bag of wet, rotting leaves. For a woman earning a starvation wage, this was a vital source of income. It was a survival strategy. She was selling the waste of the rich to feed the addiction of the poor. But wet leaves cannot be sold as tea. They are limp. They are unfurled. They look exactly like what they are: boiled vegetation. To turn this sludge back into a commercial product, it had to be processed. The collectors would take their haul to hidden drying rooms, often located in the same impoverished neighborhoods where the smouch was made. The first step was to halt the rot. The leaves were often sour, smelling of mildew and stale water. They were spread out on the same copper sheets used for the hedgerow leaves and heated over a fire. The heat drove off the moisture and killed the mold, but it also baked the leaves into a brittle, flat state. A dried, used tea leaf does not look like a fresh, dried tea leaf. A fresh leaf is twisted. It has tension and curl. A used leaf is flat and lifeless. It looks like dead autumn foliage. To fix this, the fraudsters turned to chemistry. They needed a stiffening agent. They prepared a solution of gum, often gum arabic or a cheap industrial mucilage, and sprinkled it over the drying leaves. The gum acted as a sizing agent. As the heat evaporated the water, the gum hardened, shrinking the leaf and forcing it to curl up tight again. It gave the leaf a false structural integrity. When you touched these recycled leaves, they felt crisp. They snapped satisfactorily between your fingers. They had the right weight and the right sound, but they were a hollow shell. All of the tannin, all of the caffeine, and all of the flavor had been extracted by the first drinker. The leaf was legally tea, but chemically it was a ghost. It was merely a carrier for the gum and the dust. However, there was one final problem that the gum could not fix. When you boil a tea leaf, it loses its color. These recycled leaves were not black or green. They were a dull, washed-out brown. They looked exhausted. If you put them in a shop window, no one would buy them. They needed to be dressed up. They needed a costume. And just like the Chinese merchants in Canton, the London fraudsters knew exactly which paint pot to reach for. The leaf was dry, and it was curled, but now it needed to be made beautiful again, and for that, they needed the black lead. We have resurrected the corpse of the tea leaf. We have taken a soggy, fermenting mass of vegetation from a hotel sink, dried it over a fire, and stiffened it with industrial gum. It now has the correct shape. It crinkles satisfyingly in the hand, but it still fails the most basic visual test. It looks dead. A genuine black tea leaf, properly fermented and fired, has a dark, matte intensity. It absorbs the light. The recycled leaf, having been boiled and baked twice, is a washed-out, lifeless brown. It looks like the withered foliage you might sweep off a patio in November. If a grocer tried to sell this in a glass jar, even the most ignorant customer would hesitate. The ghost needs makeup. The process of applying this makeup was known in the London trade as facing, borrowing the term from the Chinese merchants. But while the Chinese used Prussian blue to create a false green, the British adulterators needed a substance that would turn brown leaves black. They needed a pigment that was cheap, readily available, and capable of producing a permanent, convincing darkness. They found their answer in the scullery cupboard. The primary agent of this transformation was black lead. In the periodic table, we know it as plumbago, or graphite. In the Victorian home, it was a ubiquitous household chemical, but it was never intended to be edible. Its primary purpose was to polish the cast iron kitchen range. It was a heavy, greasy, metallic powder used to protect iron from rust and to give the stove a deep, lustrous, black shine. It was the substance of the fireplace, not the teapot. The fraudsters, however, saw its potential. It was the perfect cosmetic for a dying leaf. The application process was crude but effective. The dried, gum-stiffened leaves were placed into large leather bags or wooden drums. The black lead powder was tossed in with them. Sometimes, to deepen the color even further, they would add logwood. Logwood is a dyestuff derived from the heartwood of a Central American tree. In the textile industry, it was used to dye wool and silk a deep purple-black. In the tea industry, it provided the base coat, staining the brown leaf a dark, bruised purple. But the logwood was just the primer. The black lead was the polish. The workers would seal the bags and begin to shake them. It was a physical, rhythmic labor, tumbling the leaves over and over against the leather, grinding the graphite powder into the surface of the vegetation. The friction was key. Just as a maid would buff the iron grate of a stove until it gleamed, the tumbling action buffed the tea leaves. The graphite coated every wrinkle and crevice, masking the faded brown tissue underneath a layer of metallic carbon. The result was visually stunning. The recycled tea emerged from the bag not just black, but glossy. It shimmered. It had a bloom to it, a sleek satin finish that caught the light. To the Victorian consumer, this gloss was interpreted as a sign of high quality. They believed they were looking at the natural oils of a fresh, potent leaf rising to the surface. They were actually looking at a layer of pencil lead. There is a grim irony in the psychology of this fraud. The British public had been trained to believe that good tea should be shiny. They associated that sheen with freshness. The adulterators were simply giving the market what it demanded. They created a caricature of tea, a product that looked more like tea than the real thing. It was hyper-real, darker and smoother than nature could ever achieve. But the deception fell apart the moment the water hit the leaf. When you brew a cup of genuine tea, the liquid should be clear. It might be dark, but it should be translucent. When you brewed this faced tea, the chemistry unraveled. The hot water dissolved the gum and lifted the graphite from the leaf. If you looked closely at a cup of this tea, you would see a faint, oily film floating on the surface. It looked like the sheen of petrol on a wet puddle. This was the black lead, separating from the vegetable matter and drifting to the top. It was a mineral slick. And then there was the taste. Graphite is carbon. It is the same material used in the core of a pencil. When you drank this tea, you were not tasting the floral notes of the Camellia sinensis. You were tasting the schoolroom. There was a distinct metallic tang, a flavour of pencil shavings and iron filings that lingered on the tongue. It coated the mouth. It felt heavy. The Victorians often complained of a coppery or mineral taste in their water, blaming the pipes or the kettle. In reality, they were licking the inside of a pencil case. And while graphite itself is relatively inert compared to some poisons, it was rarely pure. The black lead used in industry was often contaminated with other minerals, including actual lead and antimony. You were drinking a suspension of carbon dust and industrial dye. The gloss that you admired in the caddy became the sludge in your stomach. And yet, this was merely the cosmetic layer. The black lead was used to hide the age of the leaf, but there were other chemicals, far more potent and far more specific, that were used not to hide age, but to fake specific varieties. The black lead was a blanket. The next ingredients were precision weapons. We must now turn our attention to the specific chemical profiles that were silently accumulating in the bodies of the population. We have stripped the black mask from the recycled leaf. Now, we must return to the green mask of the imported leaf. We touched upon the use of paint in the Canton warehouses earlier, but to truly understand the violation of the Victorian body, we must place this substance under the microscope. We need to isolate the specific chemical agent that defined the era's green tea trade. It was a substance that had no business entering the human digestive tract. Its name evokes the grand armies of Europe and the canvases of the old masters, but in the context of the breakfast table, it was a biological insult. We are talking about Prussian blue. To the chemist, this compound is known as ferrocyanide of iron. It is a deep, intense, synthetic pigment that was invented in Berlin in the early 18th century. It was a revolution for the art world, providing a stable, rich blue that replaced the expensive ultramarine made from crushed lapis lazuli. It was designed to be mixed with linseed oil and brushed onto canvas. It was designed to dye the uniforms of the Prussian army. It was never, under any circumstances, designed to be dissolved in hot water and swallowed by a human being. Yet for nearly 50 years, It was the primary reason British tea drinkers believed green tea was actually green. The scale of this contamination was first truly exposed by Robert Warrington of the Chemical Society in 1844. Warrington did not just look at the tea, he deconstructed it. He took samples of what was sold in London as fine green tea and subjected them to a simple washing test. He placed the leaves in a glass of water and shook them. The result was a piece of chemical theatre that horrified the scientific community. The water did not turn a pale grassy yellow. It turned a dark, murky, opaque blue. Warrington found that the leaves had been so heavily coated in the pigment that the sediment at the bottom of the glass was thick enough to be collected and analysed separately. His calculations were chilling. He estimated that in every 100 pounds of green tea imported into England, the consumer was purchasing half a pound of Prussian blue and gypsum. This means that if you were a dedicated tea drinker, consuming perhaps a pound of tea a month, you were effectively eating a teaspoon of industrial paint pigment every few weeks. The physiological effect of this ingestion was not the sudden dramatic death of arsenic poisoning. It was subtler and in some ways more insidious. Prussian blue is a cyanide compound. Now, the cyanide in the molecule is tightly bonded to the iron. It is not free cyanide, which kills instantly. However, the human stomach is not a test tube. It is a warm, acidic environment. There was a genuine medical fear that the hydrochloric acid in the stomach could slowly break down the chemical bonds, releasing small, chronic doses of cyanide into the system. While fatal poisoning from Prussian blue was rare, the immediate result was a condition the Victorians politely termed gastric irritation. This was a euphemism for a constant, gnawing discomfort. It meant nausea. It meant a heavy, cramping sensation after every meal. The pigment acted as a persistent irritant to the lining of the stomach and the intestines. You were coating your insides with the same heavy, indigestible mineral paste used to paint a fence. The body tried to reject it, leading to the bilious attacks that were so common in the literature of the time. The tragedy is that the victims often drank more tea to settle their stomachs, pouring more of the blue irritant onto the inflamed tissue. They were trying to cure the sickness with the poison. If Prussian blue was an insult to the stomach, the next ingredient was an assault on the entire system. We must now move from the realm of industrial pigments to the realm of genuine toxicity. While ferrocyanide of iron was a crude attempt to colour the leaves, the finer green teas required a more potent, more vibrant agent to achieve that electric, unnatural emerald hue that the British market craved. The merchants found their answer in the corrosion of metal. They turned to copper. Specifically, they used copper carbonate, often in the form of verdigris. To understand what you were drinking, you do not need a chemistry degree. You simply need to look at an old penny or the roof of a cathedral. You know that pale sea-green crust that forms on copper when it is exposed to the elements. That is the oxidation of the metal. It is essentially copper rust. In the art world, verdigris was used to paint landscapes. In the tea trade, it was scraped off copper plates, ground into a fine crystalline dust, and rubbed into the tea leaves to give them a bloom. This was not a passive ingredient. Copper is a heavy metal. Unlike the iron in Prussian blue, which is relatively stable, copper salts are biologically active. They are, by definition, biocides. They kill life. When dissolved in the hot water of your teapot, the copper carbonate did not just colour the liquid, it became a systemic poison. And unlike the Prussian blue, which largely passed through the digestive tract causing local irritation, the copper did not leave. It found a home. The human body has no efficient mechanism for excreting large amounts of copper. When you ingested your morning cup of fine hyson or imperial gunpowder, the copper was absorbed into the bloodstream. From there, it travelled to the filter of the body, the liver. The liver is a resilient organ designed to scrub toxins from the blood, but it is not designed to process metal filings. The copper began to accumulate. It stored itself in the tissue, building up layer by layer, cup by cup, year by year. The symptoms of this slow accumulation were often dismissed as the general malaise of the era. But if you look at the medical records, a pattern emerges. The primary symptom was a specific type of gastrointestinal distress known as copper colic. This was not the dull ache of indigestion. It was a sharp, twisting pain in the abdomen, a sensation often described as griping. It felt as if the intestines were being knotted. Accompanying this pain was a persistent, low-level nausea. The drinker would feel a constant need to vomit, yet often could not. This is because copper sulfate, a close chemical cousin, is a powerful emetic, used in medicine to induce vomiting. In the small, chronic doses found in tea, it kept the stomach in a state of perpetual revolution. But the most telling sign was sensory. Victorian tea drinkers frequently complained of a metallic taste in the mouth. They described it as coppery or brass-like. Imagine the sensation of sucking on a dirty coin. That taste would linger on the tongue long after the tea was finished. It contaminated everything else they ate. Bread tasted like tin. Butter tasted like brass. They were literally tasting the saturation of their own tissues. The tragedy is that this metallic tang was often blamed on the water pipes or the kettle itself. The household would scrub the copper kettle, assuming it was dirty, unaware that the metal was coming from the leaves inside it. And the visual evidence was there, if anyone had known where to look. When a cup of this copper-laced tea was allowed to stand and cool, a strange phenomenon occurred. A thin, iridescent film would form on the surface of the liquid. It looked like an oil slick on a wet road, a swirling, rainbow-coloured sheen. This was the bloom. It was the separated copper salts floating to the top. To the uneducated eye, it looked like the natural essential oils of the tea plant, a sign of potency. In reality, it was a chemical separation. If you were to take that tea and add a few drops of ammonia, a common test developed by chemists like Accum and Hassel, the liquid would not turn pale. It would turn a deep, stunning sapphire blue. That beautiful, clear blue was the undeniable signature of dissolved copper. You were drinking a solution that, in higher concentrations, was used to kill fungus on vines, and you were drinking it every single day, while wondering why your stomach felt like it was being twisted by a cold, iron hand. We have painted the leaves blue with iron and green with copper. You might think the palette of the adulterator was exhausted, but there was one final colour required to complete the illusion of the perfect blend. In the Victorian tea trade, there was a popular category known as mixed tea. This was a blend of black and green leaves designed to offer the strength of the former with the piquancy of the latter. But a simple mix of black and green can look dull in the caddy. To make the mixture pop, to give it a vibrant, golden, sun-drenched appeal, the fraudsters needed yellow. And to get that yellow, they reached for lead chromate. This was perhaps the most dangerous substance in the entire pantry of poisons. Lead chromate, known industrially as chrome yellow, is a vivid, opaque pigment. It was the colour of the sunflower, the colour of the canary, and the colour of the paint used on the carriages of the wealthy. It is a salt derived from chromic acid and lead. It combines two distinct toxicities into a single bright crystal. You have the corrosive, ulcerating nature of the chromate, and you have the heavy, neurotoxic weight of the lead. The application was cosmetic, as always. The fraudsters would dust the tea leaves with this yellow powder to brighten them, or use it to coat the lye tea pellets to mimic the look of a specific, high-quality bud. It gave the tea a warm, golden dust that suggested a harvest in the height of summer. But once that golden dust dissolved in your kettle, you were ingesting a metal that the human body is fundamentally incapable of handling. The horror of lead poisoning lies in its permanence. Unlike alcohol, which the body metabolizes and expels, or even the copper which the liver desperately tries to filter, lead is a squatter. It mimics calcium. When it enters the bloodstream, the body, in a tragic case of biological mistaken identity, welcomes it. It absorbs the lead and deposits it where it stores calcium, in the teeth and in the bones. This is the concept of cumulative poisoning. It is a slow, silent mathematics of death. 1 cup of tea laced with lead chromate would not kill you. It would not even make you retch. But the lead from that cup would settle in your femur or your rib cage, and it would stay there. The next day you would drink another cup and add another grain to the stockpile. You were building a bank account of heavy metal within your own skeleton. Over months and years of daily tea drinking, the ritual that defined the rhythm of Victorian life, the levels of lead in the tissues would rise until they reached a critical threshold. And because lead targets the nervous system, the symptoms were not just digestive, they were psychological and neurological. This poison did not just attack the gut, it attacked the self. The first signs were often subtle. The tea drinker might feel a strange, unshakable lethargy. The lead interferes with the production of hemoglobin, leading to a deep grey pallor of the skin. The Victorians often romanticized this pale look as a sign of gentility or poetic sensitivity, but in reality, it was the complexion of anemia induced by metal poisoning. Then came the nerves. Lead strips the insulation from the nerve fibers. The result was a condition that doctors of the era frequently diagnosed as hysteria or hypochondriasis, particularly in women, who were the heaviest consumers of tea. The patient would feel a constant, low-level anxiety. Their hands would develop a fine tremor, the tea shakes. They would suffer from insomnia, lying awake at night with a heart that seemed to flutter and race. They felt as if their nerves were jangling, like wires pulled too tight. As the toxicity deepened, the symptoms became more grotesque. Lead poisoning attacks the motor nerves that control the muscles, specifically the extensors in the arms. This led to a classic, terrifying symptom known as wrist drop. The patient would lose the strength to lift their hand at the wrist. If they tried to raise their arm, the hand would hang limp and useless, like the flipper of a seal. It was a paralysis that crept in slowly, often blamed on rheumatism or the vapors, but it was the direct result of the yellow dust in the teapot severing the connection between the will and the limb. Perhaps the most chilling sign, however, was visible in the mouth. If you were to look at the gums of a heavy tea drinker suffering from this affliction, you might see a thin, dark blue line running along the margin where the teeth met the flesh. This was Burton's line. It was the visual evidence of the lead reacting with bacteria in the mouth to form lead sulfide. It was a literal tattoo of poisoning, etched into the smile of the victim. The tragedy of lead chromate was that it created a vicious cycle. The tea drinker, feeling weak, anxious, and nervous due to the lead, would turn to the teapot for comfort. They would brew a stronger cup, seeking the stimulation of the caffeine to lift their mood and steady their trembling hands. In doing so, they poured more of the neurotoxin into their system, accelerating the decline. They were treating the symptoms of poisoning with the poison itself, descending into a madness and paralysis that was entirely preventable, yet sold to them in a packet labelled pure mixed tea. If you walked into a physician's consulting room in London in the middle of the 19th century, presenting with a pale complexion, a trembling hand, and a vague, gnawing sense of doom, you would likely receive a very specific diagnosis. The doctor, a man of science and whiskers, would listen to your racing heart, observe the twitching of your eyelids, and nod gravely. He would not tell you that you were suffering from lead poisoning. He would not tell you that your liver was saturated with copper. He would tell you that you were suffering from tea sickness. It was a recognized medical condition of the era, a malady that seemed to afflict the nerves and the spirit in equal measure. In the medical literature of the time, it was described with a mixture of clinical fascination and moral judgment. The doctors called it a slow poison, a phrase that captured the creeping, insidious nature of the decline. It was not a sickness that struck you down in the street. It was a sickness that unraveled you, thread by thread, while you sat in your own armchair. The symptoms described in the journals of the day paint a harrowing picture of sensory disintegration. Dr. Thomas Young, writing in 1773, described a farmer's wife who drank strong tea for 4 years and eventually lost the use of her limbs, suffering a paralysis he attributed to the corrosive qualities of the leaf. Thomas Short linked the habit to chronic fear and grief. The primary complaint was a sensation of jangling. Patients described their nerves not as biological tissue, but as overstrung wires or vibrating cords that had been pulled too tight. Every noise, the clatter of a carriage, the dropping of a spoon, sent a shockwave through their system. They lived in a state of perpetual electric anxiety. This was often accompanied by a condition the Victorians labelled hypochondriasis. Today, we might dismiss this as a psychological issue, a fear of illness rather than illness itself. But in the context of the adulterated teapot, the hypochondria was a rational response to a body that was slowly failing. The patient felt wrong. They felt a sinking in the stomach, a fluttering in the chest, and a confusion in the mind. They were being poisoned by heavy metals, which are potent neurotoxins. But because they had no language for this, they experienced it as a collapse of the self. The physical manifestations were just as distressing. The tea tremor was a common sight in the parlours of the heavy drinker. It was a fine, rhythmic shaking of the hands that made the simple act of lifting a teacup a challenge. The saucer would rattle against the cup, a tiny porcelain alarm bell signalling the damage being done to the motor nerves. In severe cases, this tremor spread to the tongue, causing a stutter, or to the legs, leading to a staggering gait that mimicked drunkenness. There were accounts of patients suffering from paralysis, where limbs would feel heavy and unresponsive, as if they were made of lead, a description that was, tragically, chemically accurate. Others reported formication, the terrifying sensation of small insects crawling under the skin, a classic symptom of nervous system toxicity that the doctors attributed to the stimulating excess of the tea leaf. The medical profession, for all its learning, was largely looking at the wrong culprit. They blamed the Thea sinensis. They wrote long, scolding treatises on the dangers of caffeine and tannin. They argued that tea was a desiccating agent that dried out the humours and corroded the stomach lining. They believed that the working classes were drinking themselves into early graves because their constitutions could not handle the potent stimulation of the herb. They were analysing the vehicle, not the passenger. They saw the gastric irritation and blamed the astringency of the tea rather than the abrasive glass of the Prussian blue. They saw the nervous exhaustion and blamed the caffeine rather than the cumulative neurotoxicity of the lead chromate. It was a colossal failure of epidemiological detective work. The doctors were right that the tea was killing their patients, but they were wrong about how. This misdiagnosis led to a cruel irony in the treatment. The prescription for tea sickness was often rest, a bland diet, and, crucially, a cessation of tea drinking. When the patients stopped drinking the tea, they often improved. The tremors subsided, the stomach settled, the colour returned to their cheeks. The doctors took this as proof that tea itself was the villain. See, they would say, the herb is a poison. They did not realize that they had simply removed the source of the copper and the lead. The recovery was not a detox from caffeine, it was a detox from industrial paint. But the moment the patient felt better, they would often return to their habit, believing that perhaps they had just overindulged, or that a better quality tea would be safe. They would go to a more expensive grocer, buy a pure green tea that cost 7 shillings a pound, and unwittingly purchase a higher concentration of verdigris. The slow death was a cycle of poisoning, recovery, and repoisoning. It was a game of Russian roulette played with a china cup, where the bullet was a microscopic grain of metal. And while the doctors debated the morality of the tea habit, the true danger lay not just in the cup, but in the very infrastructure of the room where it was prepared. The tea was poisoned, yes, but to understand the full scope of the threat, we must leave the parlour and the doctor's office. We must go down the stairs, past the baize door, and enter the dark, soot-choked world where the water was boiled. The tea was bad, but the kitchen was a trap. We have analysed the tea leaf in the laboratory, and we have diagnosed the drinker in the consulting room. But to fully understand the cup of tea, we must understand the logistics of its preparation. We must leave the comfort of the parlour, with its velvet curtains and ticking clocks, and descend into the belly of the house. We are going down the stone stairs, past the baize door that separates the family from the staff, and into the scullery. This is where the water is boiled. This is where the illusion of civilization is manufactured out of coal dust and elbow grease. It is 6 o'clock in the morning in a London winter. It is pitch black outside, and it is pitch black inside. The house is silent, but you are awake. In the hierarchy of the Victorian household, you are the scullery maid. You are the lowest ranking member of the staff, often a teenage girl, and you are the engine that powers the day. Your first task, before you can even think of breakfast, is to wake the monster in the kitchen. You step onto the flagstones of the scullery floor. They are damp and radiating a cold that seeps through the soles of your boots. The air here smells of stale vegetables, damp wool, and the sharp, acrid scent of yesterday's coal smoke. Looming in the darkness is the kitchen range. This is not a stove as we understand it today. It is a massive, cast iron infrastructure, a wall of metal that weighs 1/2 ton. It is the heart of the house, and it has gone cold during the night. Your job is to bring it back to life. You kneel on the stone floor in front of the grate. The first sensory reality of the morning is the ash. You take a heavy iron rake and begin to scrape out the clinker, the fused lumps of burnt coal and slag left over from the day before. As you rake, a cloud of fine grey dust billows out into the room. It settles on your skin, it coats your apron, and you breathe it in. It tastes of sulphur and burnt earth. This ash is not sterile. It is the gritty residue of the industrial fuel that powers the empire. Once the grate is clear, you must lay the fire. You are not using clean, kiln-dried logs. You are using coal. You have to haul the coal scuttle from the cellar. It is a heavy iron bucket filled with black rocks. You shovel the coal into the moor of the range, building the structure carefully so it will catch. When you light it, the smoke does not vanish up a chimney immediately. In a cold range, the draught has not yet established itself. The smoke rolls back into the room, stinging your eyes and catching in your throat. You are coughing in the dark, fanning the flames, waiting for the iron to heat up. But the fire is only half the battle. The range must be clean, and in the Victorian mind, clean meant black. This brings us back to a familiar substance. To maintain the range, you must polish it with black lead. This is the same graphite paste we saw used to disguise the exhausted tea leaves. You take a brush and a pot of this greasy metallic sludge, and you scrub the iron front of the stove until it gleams. You are literally covering your workspace in the same material that is poisoning the tea upstairs. Your hands are stained black with it. The air is thick with the smell of it. The physical exertion required to get this iron beast up to temperature is immense. You are sweating in a freezing room, and you are doing this for one primary reason: to boil the water. The range has a built-in boiler at the back, a tank that must be filled by hand. You pump the water from the scullery sink, carrying heavy jugs to fill the reservoir. It takes time for that volume of water to heat. It is a slow, inefficient thermodynamic struggle. By the time the upper servants, the cook, the butler, the housekeeper, drift downstairs at 7 or 8 o'clock, they expect the kettle to be singing. They expect a clean, hot kitchen. They do not see the hour of struggle in the dark. They do not taste the coal dust that you have swallowed. They simply see the water. But as you pour that boiling water into the teapot, watching the steam rise, you are unaware that the water itself is the final traitor in this story. You watch the boiling water hit the tea leaves. You watch the steam rise, carrying the scent of the smouch and the graphite. But before the water even touched the adulterated leaves, before it was poured by the scullery maid's red, chapped hands, it was already compromised. We tend to think of water as the neutral element in the equation of cooking, a blank canvas upon which flavour is painted. But in the Victorian home, the water was an active, chemical participant in the poisoning of the household. It was not a solvent, it was a delivery system. To understand why, you have to look at the anatomy of the house itself. The Victorian era was the golden age of indoor plumbing for the middle and upper classes. It was a marvel of engineering that allowed water to flow magically into the kitchen and the water closet. But the material that made this miracle possible was lead. The very word plumbing is derived from the Latin plumbum, meaning lead. The pipes that snaked through the walls, twisting around corners and running under the floorboards, were made of pure, soft lead. Lead was the material of choice because it was malleable. A plumber could bend it with his hands, shaping it to fit the idiosyncratic architecture of a London townhouse. It did not burst in the frost as easily as iron, and it did not rust. It was the perfect engineering solution, and a catastrophic biological one. As the water travelled from the main in the street to the tap in the scullery, it was running through a tunnel of neurotoxin. The friction of the water, day after day, year after year, slowly scoured the interior of the pipe, dissolving microscopic particles of the metal into the flow. But the pipes were only the conduit. The real danger lay in storage. Most Victorian houses did not draw water directly from the high-pressure main for every use. Instead, the water was pumped up to a cistern, usually located in the attic or directly under the roof. These cisterns were large, open-topped tanks designed to hold a day's supply of water, and almost without exception, they were lined with lead. Imagine the condition of this water. It sits in the dark in a cold, dusty attic. The cistern is often uncovered. Dead insects, dust, soot, and occasionally the carcass of a rat or a bird would fall into the tank and slowly decompose at the bottom. But the chemistry was the greater threat. The water would sit in this lead-lined box for hours, sometimes days, steeping. It was a cold brew of heavy metal. This danger was exacerbated by a specific preference of the tea drinker. To make a good cup of tea, one requires soft water. Hard water, which is rich in calcium and magnesium, forms a scum on the tea and dulls the flavour. Soft water extracts the tannins and the delicate notes of the leaf much more effectively. But chemically, soft water is hungry. It is aggressive. Because it lacks mineral content, it is more solvent. It dissolves lead pipes and lead linings far more rapidly than hard water, which tends to form a protective scale on the inside of the pipe. So, the Victorian connoisseur, seeking the perfect brew, would specifically seek out soft water sources. In doing so, They were maximizing the lead content of their cup. The water that tasted the sweetest and brewed the clearest tea was often the water with the highest concentration of the metal. They were selecting for toxicity. And if your water did not come from a lead pipe, it likely came from a source that offered an entirely different spectrum of death. Before the great sanitary reforms of the mid-century, much of London's water was drawn from the Thames or from shallow wells. This water was a biological soup. It was contaminated with the runoff from cesspits, the refuse of slaughterhouses, and the raw sewage of a city of millions. The scullery maid, boiling the kettle at 6 in the morning, was performing a vital act of sterilization. The boiling killed the cholera bacteria. It killed the typhoid. It killed the microscopic parasites that lived in the monster soup of the river water. But boiling does not remove lead. In fact, as the water boils and evaporates in the kettle, the concentration of the heavy metals slightly increases. The heat that destroyed the biological threat only served to refine the chemical one. And into this compromised heavy liquid, you are about to pour the next ingredient. You add milk, believing it will soothe the stomach and dilute the strength of the tea. But the milk is not the antidote. The milk is the next lie. You pour the milk into the cup. It swirls through the dark, lead-poisoned liquid, creating a cloud of comforting beige. For the Victorian drinker, this splash of milk was the saving grace of the ritual. It was the cooling agent, the sweetener, the substance that promised health and vitality. Milk was the food of infants, the symbol of purity, the white liquor of life. But in the mid-19th century city, the milk jug was often the most dangerous vessel on the table. If the tea was a fraud of leaves and paint, the milk was a fraud of biology and decay. To understand the scale of this deception, you must learn the slang of the Victorian dairyman. He did not talk about the Jersey or the Guernsey cow. He talked about the iron cow. This was the pump. In the backyards of the London dairies, or in the muddy yards of the farms on the city's fringe, the pump was the most profitable animal in the herd. It never got sick, it never needed feeding, and it produced an endless supply of liquid. It was estimated that in some districts of London, every pint of milk sold contained at least 25 to 50% water. But water has a telltale signature. When you dilute milk heavily, it loses its rich, creamy opacity. It becomes thin. It takes on a sickly, translucent blue tint known as sky blue. A customer looking at a jug of this blue wash would know instantly that they were being cheated. So, the adulterator had to become a cosmetic chemist. He had to restore the whiteness, the thickness, and the illusion of cream. He had to rebuild the body of the milk using the contents of the pantry and the apothecary's shelf. The first line of defense against the blue ruin of the milk was starch. The dairyman would mix flour or boiled rice into the liquid. This thickened the texture, giving it a false viscosity that mimicked the mouthfeel of cream. If flour was too expensive, or if he wanted a starker white, he would use chalk. Finely ground chalk, whiting, or plaster of Paris would be whisked into the churns. It turned the blue water white again. But it had a side effect. If you let your glass of milk stand for too long, the chalk would settle out of suspension. You would be left with a layer of watery whey on top and a thick, gritty sludge of wet plaster at the bottom. But starch and chalk only mimic the look of fat. They do not mimic the behavior of fat. Real milk has a froth. It has a richness that coats the tongue. To replicate this, the fraudsters turned to a substance that is perhaps the most grotesque ingredient in our entire culinary journey. They went to the butcher. There are documented cases, cited in the parliamentary reports of the era, of dairymen using sheep's brains to simulate cream. The brains were purchased cheap from the slaughterhouse. They were mashed into a fine grey paste, creating a fatty emulsion. This paste was then whisked vigorously into the watered-down milk. The brain matter dissolved into the liquid, adding a layer of animal fat that rose to the top, mimicking the cream line that housewives looked for as a sign of quality. Imagine the reality of this. You are sitting in your parlour, sipping your tea. You admire the rich, frothy head on your milk. You believe it is the product of a healthy cow grazing in a green pasture. In reality, it is the cerebral matter of a slaughtered sheep, beaten into a suspension to hide the fact that your milk is half water. It is a level of adulteration that moves beyond fraud and into the realm of Gothic horror. But even if the milk looked white and felt thick, it faced a greater enemy: time. Milk is a volatile substance. In the days before refrigeration, in the heat of a London summer, milk would sour in a matter of hours. The bacteria would multiply, turning the lactose into lactic acid, curdling the liquid and making it undrinkable. For the milkman, a sour churn was a lost profit. He needed the milk to stay sweet for days, even as it sat in open pails in the warm, fly-blown air of the shop. The solution was chemical embalming. The dairyman became a mortician. He treated the living fluid as if it were a corpse. The weapon of choice was borax or boric acid. This chemical is a powerful preservative. It kills the bacteria that cause souring. By dosing the milk with borax, the dairyman could keep it tasting sweet long after it should have turned. The milk was essentially dead. The bacterial activity had been chemically halted, but borax was mild compared to the other option: formaldehyde. This is the fluid used to preserve biological specimens in jars. It was sold to dairymen under friendly trade names like Mistin, promising to keep milk fresh for a week. When you drank formaldehyde-laced milk, it did not taste sour. It tasted oddly sweet, with a faint chemical tang. It preserved the milk, but it hardened the digestion. It turned the protein in the stomach into a rubbery, indigestible mass. And behind the chalk, the brains and the formaldehyde, there lurked the white plague: tuberculosis. The cows that produced this milk were often kept in city basements, standing knee-deep in manure, never seeing the sun. They were riddled with bovine tuberculosis. The milk was unpasteurized. It was a direct vector for the disease. The milk sickness that swept through Victorian nurseries was not a vague ailment. It was often TB, transmitted from the lungs of a sick cow to the lungs of a child via a cup of pure milk. But the cup is not yet finished. It is bitter. It needs sweetness. You reach for the sugar bowl, hoping for a simple, honest crystal. But the grocer has been there before you. You reach for the sugar bowl. It is the final act of faith in the tea ritual. You have accepted the risk of the painted leaves, the leaded water, and the embalmed milk because you believe that, at the very least, the sugar will redeem them. Sugar is the great masker. It is the substance we use to hide the bitterness of reality. You expect a simple, soluble crystal that will vanish into the heat of the cup and leave behind nothing but sweetness. But in the Victorian grocery trade, sweetness was a commodity that carried a heavy burden of filth. When you look at the sugar in the bowl, particularly if it is the moist brown sugar that was the staple of the middle-class kitchen, you are looking at a product that is not entirely vegetable. It is partly mineral. Sugar was expensive. It was sold by the pound, and there was one substance that resembled the crystalline structure of sugar, cost almost nothing, and weighed significantly more: sand. This was not the soft, powdery sand of a dune. This was sharp sand, or crystalline silica. It was chosen specifically because its faceted, glittering grains mimicked the look of sugar crystals. When mixed into the brown sugar, it disappeared visually, but it did not disappear physically. The grocer would mix in percentages ranging from 6 to 10%. When you bought a pound of sugar, you were buying 1.5 ounces of the beach. The sensory consequence of this fraud was immediate and unpleasant. Sugar dissolves in hot water. Sand does not. As you stirred your tea, The sugar would melt away, but the silica would remain. It would settle at the bottom of the cup, mingling with the tea dust and the lead sediment. When you took that final sip, you would feel the grit between your teeth. It was a sensation like chewing on glass. It grated against the enamel, a sharp, geological reminder that you had been cheated. But the sand was merely a nuisance. It was inert. It would not poison you, though it might crack a tooth. The true horror of the Victorian sugar bowl was not mineral. It was biological. If you were to take a pinch of that moist brown sugar and place it under the lens of one of Dr. Hassel's new microscopes, you would see that the pile was moving. It was alive. You would be staring at the Acarus saccharine, or the sugar mite. This was a microscopic arachnid, a cousin of the spider and the tick. It thrived in the raw, unrefined sugars imported from the colonies. These sugars were often stored in damp, humid warehouses that acted as perfect breeding grounds. The mites were hideous to behold, bulbous, bristling with hairs, and equipped with powerful mandibles for burrowing. And they were present in numbers that defy the imagination. Dr. Hassel estimated that in a single pound of raw sugar, there could be as many as 100,000 of these creatures. When you spooned 2 teaspoons of sugar into your tea, you were not just sweetening the drink. You were dumping a colony of 500 living arachnids into your cup. The heat of the tea would kill them, of course. They would float to the surface, forming a scum that mingled with the milk fat and the black lead oil. But you were still ingesting their bodies, their waste, and the bacteria they carried. The presence of these mites was so pervasive that it created an occupational hazard for the grocers themselves. The men who handled this sugar, plunging their bare hands into the sacks to weigh it out, often suffered from a condition known as grocer's itch. The mites, disturbed by the scoop, would migrate from the sugar onto the hand of the grocer. They would burrow into the skin, causing a pustular, burning rash that travelled up the arms. It was a parasitic infestation transferred from the food to the cellar. And every time that grocer, scratching his inflamed hands, reached back into the sack to serve you, the cycle of contamination continued. The horror of the mite drove the public toward refined white sugar. They believed that the white loaf sugar, which was hard and dry, would be free of the parasites. And they were right. The mites could not survive the refining process. But to achieve that stark, snowy whiteness, the refiners had to use chemistry. To purge the brown molasses and the biological filth from the sugar, they used bullock's blood to clarify the syrup. Then, to ensure the crystal was perfectly white, they treated it with sulfuric acid. In some cases, to get the loaf to set hard and glisten, they added trace amounts of lead acetate. The sugar did not mask the poison in the tea, it simply added a new layer of toxicity to the mix. And yet, the ritual demanded one final accompaniment. You cannot have tea without a treat. You reach for the bright green sweet on the side of the saucer. The tea has been drunk. The cup sits empty, a residue of lead dust and sand settling at the bottom. The milk has left a film on the china that is chemically closer to embalming fluid than dairy. But the Victorian ritual is not quite finished. You have survived the beverage, and now, to cleanse the palate of that metallic, coppery tang, you reach for the final accompaniment. Sitting on a delicate lace doily on the side of the saucer is a sweet. It is a small, hard lozenge, perhaps shaped like a leaf or a fruit. It is undeniably beautiful. In a world of grey fog and brown mud, the Victorian table was desperate for colour, and this sweet offers it. It is a brilliant, vivid, electric green. It matches the colour of the fashionable wallpaper in the parlour and the silk of the lady's evening gown. It glows with an intensity that nature rarely produces in food. And just like the tea leaves that were painted to look fresh, this confectionery has been painted to look appetizing. But while the tea was dusted with copper, the sweet has been dyed with something far more final. The pigment responsible for this stunning emerald hue is known as Sheila's green. Chemically, it is copper arsenite. It was invented in the late 18th century by a Swedish chemist, and it quickly became the darling of the colouring industry. It was cheap, it was stable, and it produced a green that did not fade. It was used in paints, in fabrics, in wallpapers, and, with a terrifying lack of regulation, in food. When you place that green sweet on your tongue, you are introducing a concentrated dose of arsenic directly into your system. Arsenic is a poison that mimics the symptoms of food poisoning so perfectly that it was the weapon of choice for the 19th century murderer. It is tasteless, odourless, and colourless in solution, but in the form of Scheele's green, it was hiding in plain sight. The very vibrancy that attracted the eye was the signal of the toxicity. This was not a theoretical danger. In 1858, the link between the sugar bowl and the coffin became horrifyingly literal in the industrial town of Bradford. The incident, known to history as the Bradford sweets poisoning, serves as the grim crescendo to our culinary tour. It began, as all these tragedies did, with the desire to save a few pennies. A local sweet maker, selling his wares at the market, wanted to cut the cost of his sugar. Sugar was expensive, so it was common practice to mix it with a filler substance known in the trade as daft. Daft was usually powdered gypsum or plaster of Paris, indigestible but generally harmless stone dust. It was the same logic as the sand in the grocery sugar: bulk up the weight, reduce the cost. The sweet maker sent his assistant to the druggist to purchase a supply of this daft. The druggist was ill, and his young assistant was left in charge. He went down into the cellar to fetch the barrel of plaster. In the dim light of the gas lamps, he mistook the barrels. Instead of scooping out 12 pounds of harmless gypsum, he scooped out 12 pounds of white arsenic trioxide. The poison was carried back to the sweet factory. It was mixed into 40 pounds of sugar and peppermint oil. The arsenic was so heavy that the workers noted the mixture seemed strange, but they proceeded anyway. They rolled the paste into lozenges, humbugs, and set them out for sale at the Saturday market. That night, hundreds of people bought the sweets. They were a cheap treat for the working class, a moment of sugar in a hard week. By Sunday morning, the town of Bradford was in the grip of a catastrophe. Doctors were summoned to house after house, finding patients vomiting violently, their skin turning blue, their bodies racked with cramps. At first, the physicians panicked, believing that an outbreak of cholera had struck the town. The symptoms of acute arsenic poisoning, the purging, the dehydration, the collapse, are almost identical to those of the deadly waterborne disease. But cholera does not strike 200 people in a single night without warning. As the bodies began to pile up, 20 people died, many of them children. The connection was made. The police traced the sickness back to the stall in the green market. When they analysed the remaining sweets, they found that each lozenge contained enough arsenic to kill 2 men. The public was horrified. They had been eating poison not because of a secret plot, but because of a logistical error in a supply chain that viewed plaster of Paris as a legitimate food ingredient. The Bradford poisoning was the breaking point. It was the moment when the British public realised that their kitchen was not a sanctuary, but a minefield. The illusion of the Victorian table had shattered. The people were getting sick, and for the first time, science was about to step in and tell them why. The tragedy at Bradford was a public spectacle, a sudden, violent eruption of the poison that usually flowed silently through the veins of the city. It was undeniable proof that the food supply had become a weapon, but the warning signs had been posted nearly 40 years earlier. Long before the arsenic lozenges killed the children of Bradford, a man had walked into the polite society of Regency London and placed a literary bomb on the shelves of the booksellers. His name was Frederick Accum. He was a German chemist, an outsider who looked at the British food system not with the nostalgia of tradition, but with the cold, analytical eye of the laboratory. In 1820, he published a treatise that would destroy his life. The title was not subtle. It was a declaration of war. He called it A Treatise on Adulterations of Food and Culinary Poisons. The cover of the book featured a stark, Gothic woodcut. It depicted a spider web woven over a cooking vessel, the strands ensnaring the unsuspecting prey. Beneath this grim image was a quote taken directly from the Old Testament, from the second book of Kings. "There is death in the pot." With that single phrase, Accum shattered the sanctity of the Victorian home. Before this moment, the kitchen was viewed as the hearth, the centre of warmth and safety, the place where the mother nourished the child. Accum reframed the kitchen as a laboratory of horrors. He argued that the grocer and the brewer were not benevolent providers, but chemists of the lowest order, prioritizing profit over human life. Accum was the first man to successfully apply the emerging science of chemistry to the contents of the pantry. He did not rely on hearsay. He relied on reagents. He bought the pickles that were a vibrant, unnatural green and tested them for copper. He bought the nutty flavored sherry and tested it for bitter almonds and prussic acid. He bought the tea and tested it for sloe leaves and logwood, and then he did the unthinkable. He published the results. He laid out the recipes of fraud in plain English, stripping away the mystery of the trade. He explained to the housewife that the crust on her port wine, which she believed was a sign of age and quality, was actually a layer of crystallized supertartrate of potash and artificial coloring matter, applied to the bottle to fake antiquity. He explained that the bread on her table was white, not because the flour was pure, but because it was bleached with alum, a chemical used to tan leather. The public reaction was a mixture of terrified fascination and aggressive denial. Accum's book became a bestseller. People read it with the same morbid curiosity they applied to the Newgate calendar of crimes. It was a horror story where the monster was the dinner. But while the public shuddered, the industry snarled. Accum had broken the code of silence. He had threatened the profits of the most powerful trade guilds in the city, particularly the brewers, whom he accused of drugging beer with heavy narcotics to simulate strength. The empire struck back with a vengeance. The merchants did not attack his science because his science was irrefutable. Instead, they attacked the man. They launched a campaign of character assassination that was as toxic as the ingredients he had exposed. They called him a sensationalist. They mocked his German origins. And finally, they found a legal pretext to destroy him. Accum was accused of mutilating books in the library of the Royal Institution, tearing out pages to save time on note-taking. It was a petty charge, likely amplified or engineered by his enemies to ensure his disgrace. In the rigid social code of the era, it was fatal. Facing a trial and total public ruin, he fled England and returned to Berlin. The man who tried to save the British stomach was exiled by the British establishment. His voice was silenced, and the death in the pot continued to simmer for another 30 years. Accum had the chemistry, but he lacked the ultimate weapon. He could prove the presence of poisons, but he could not show the public the physical structure of the lie. To do that, the world needed to wait for a better lens. The chemistry set was not enough. The crusade needed a microscope. Frederick Accum was silenced, and for 30 years the grocers breathed a sigh of relief. The death in the pot became an old story, a ghost story told to frighten children. But the trade returned to business as usual. The sand went back into the sugar, and the copper went back onto the tea leaves. The merchants believed they were safe because they had defeated the chemist. They knew how to hide from the test tube. They knew how to bribe the inspector. But they did not anticipate the arrival of a man who would look at their products through a completely different lens. In the early 1850s, a new figure stepped onto the stage of London's public health. His name was Dr. Arthur Hill Hassell. Unlike Accum, who was a firebrand, Hassell was a methodical, quiet observer. He was a physician and a botanist, a man who spent his days cataloguing the minute structures of the natural world, and he possessed a weapon that the previous generation of fraud hunters lacked. He had the compound microscope. To the Victorian grocer, the microscope was a toy, a parlour amusement used to look at the wings of a fly or a drop of pond water. They did not understand that in the hands of a trained botanist, it was an instrument of judgment. Accum's chemistry could tell you that there was iron in the tea, but it could not tell you where the leaf came from. It could detect the poison, but it could not identify the fraud of the leaf itself. Hassel realized that chemistry was blind to structure, but the microscope saw everything. He began a systematic analysis of the British food supply that was unprecedented in its scope. He took the pure green tea and placed a single, rehydrated leaf under the brass cylinder of his instrument. He adjusted the mirror to catch the light, turned the focus wheel, and looked into the hidden world of the cup. What he saw was a botanical fingerprint. A genuine tea leaf has a very specific structure. Its margin is serrated with teeth that hook inward. Its veins flow in a distinctive looping pattern. Its surface is covered in stomata, breathing pores, of a particular shape. When Hassel looked at the tea sold in London shops, he often saw none of these things. Instead, he saw the smooth, toothless edge of a hawthorn leaf. He saw the cellular structure of the sloe and the elder. When he looked at the lye tea pellets, the microscope revealed them to be a chaotic landscape of glue, dust, and starch. He could identify the specific type of starch used to bind the fake pellet. He could tell the difference between the granule of a potato and the granule of a rice grain. He could see the sharp, angular shards of the quartz sand mixed into the sugar. He could see the jagged crystals of the copper poison clinging to the surface of the leaf like climbing vines. The microscope stripped away the illusion. To the naked eye, the tea looked like tea. To the lens, it looked like a crime scene. But Hassel knew that scientific observation in a private journal would not change the habits of a profitable empire. He needed a platform. He found it in Thomas Wackley, the radical reformer and editor of The Lancet, the premier medical journal of the age. Together, they launched the Analytical Sanitary Commission. It was a grand title for what was essentially a public shaming campaign. They decided that they would not just publish the results of the tests, they would publish the names of the men who sold the poison. This was a revolutionary and dangerous tactic. In the past, reports would vaguely mention a grocer in the West End. Hassel and Wackley printed the full name and the full address. Week after week, the Lancet published its findings. They listed the black list of adulterators. Mr. John Smith of Oxford Street, adulterated. Messrs. Jones of the Strand, heavily adulterated. They also published a white list of the few honest merchants they found. The impact was seismic. The grocers could ignore a lecture on morality, and they could ignore a fine from a magistrate, but they could not ignore the loss of their reputation. The public began to read the Lancet not for medical news, but as a consumer guide. A mention on the blacklist was a commercial death sentence. The microscope had made the invisible visible, and the printing press had made the secret public. The grocers panicked. They threatened lawsuits, but Wackley challenged them to prove him wrong. None dared, because the evidence was preserved on glass slides in Hassel's laboratory. The naming names strategy broke the code of silence that had protected the trade for a century. The industry was finally scared, and the government, watching the public outcry, realized they could no longer leave the regulation of the kitchen to the conscience of the merchant. Hassel's microscope had embarrassed the grocers, and the Lancet had ruined their reputations. But shame is a fleeting weapon. A grocer named on the black list might lose his fashionable customers, but he could still sell his poisoned wares to the poor, who had neither the literacy to read the medical journals nor the money to shop elsewhere. The exposure of the fraud was a moral victory, but it was not a legal one. For the poison to be truly stopped, the slow, grinding machinery of the British Parliament had to be engaged. The state, usually so reluctant to interfere with the sacred rights of commerce, was finally forced to admit that the liberty of the subject should not include the liberty to sell lead as food. The first attempt to codify this new morality came in 1872, with the passing of the Adulteration of Food, Drink and Drugs Act. On parchment, it looked like a formidable piece of legislation. It empowered local authorities to appoint public analysts, men like Hassel, to test samples in every district. It set fines for adulteration. It threatened imprisonment for repeat offenders. It seemed as though the era of the smooch and the lie tea was finally over. But the merchants who lobbied the politicians had managed to insert a single, fatal flaw into the text. It was a trapdoor in the legislation, a tiny linguistic loophole that rendered the entire act almost unenforceable. That loophole was the word knowingly. Under the 1872 Act, to convict a grocer of selling adulterated tea, the prosecutor had to prove that the grocer knew the tea was poisoned. This created a legal farce in the courtrooms of London. A grocer would stand in the dock, clutching his hat, presenting a face of cherubic innocence to the magistrate. He would admit that the tea contained iron filings and Prussian blue, yes, but he would claim that he had bought it from a wholesaler in good faith. "I am but a humble shopkeeper," he would plead. "I am not a chemist. How was I to know?" Unless the prosecutor could produce a witness who had actually seen the grocer mixing the sand into the sugar, the defense worked. The grocer was acquitted, and he went back to his shop to sell the rest of his stock. The law was a tiger without teeth, and the trade continued to hide behind the shield of feigned incompetence. It took another 3 years of public outrage and legal failure to close the trapdoor. The turning point was the Sale of Food and Drugs Act of 1875. This was the piece of legislation that finally changed the definition of responsibility in the food trade. It stripped away the defense of ignorance. It stated, in clear, unforgiving terms, that the seller was responsible for the nature, substance, and quality of the article demanded by the purchaser. The burden of proof shifted overnight. If a customer asked for tea and the grocer sold them a mixture of leaves and lead paint, the grocer was guilty. It did not matter if he didn't know about the paint. It was now his legal duty to know. If he wanted to sell food, he had to ensure it was food. This terrified the trade. It meant that ignorance was no longer an excuse, it was a liability. But the most specific and devastating blow to the tea fraudsters came at the border. Section 30 of the Act mandated that all tea imported into Great Britain could be subject to analysis by the customs authorities at the port of entry. The tea inspector became the gatekeeper of the empire's breakfast. Before the chests could even leave the damp, bonded warehouses of the London docks, they had to be sampled. If a shipment was found to be exhausted or mixed with other substances, it was not just fined, it was condemned. The effect was immediate and logistical. The British merchants, terrified of having their expensive cargoes seized and destroyed by customs, stopped buying the trash. The relentless economic pressure of the seizure did what moral arguments never could. The supply chain began to clean itself up, not out of virtue, but out of the fear of the inspector's seal. The era of open poisoning was ending, but the market, as always, would find a new way to evolve. The Act of 1875 was a triumph of legislation. But laws are only words on paper until they are enforced. The tea inspector could patrol the docks, and the public analyst could test the samples, but they could not stand behind the counter of every shop in the British Empire. As long as tea was sold loose, scooped out of a large open canister and weighed into a paper screw in front of the customer, the opportunity for fraud remained. The open bin was the weak link in the chain. It was a vessel of anonymity, Once the tea left the bonded warehouse and entered the grocer's shop, its identity was lost. It became simply tea, a substance that could be mixed, cut, and dusted with whatever the shopkeeper had hidden under the counter. To truly kill the smooch industry, the market needed a mechanism that bypassed the grocer entirely. It needed a way to transport the tea from the warehouse to the teapot without a single human hand touching it in between. The solution was not chemical, nor was it legal. It was packaging. And the man who pioneered this revolution was a Quaker from the Isle of Wight named John Horniman. Horniman understood something fundamental about the Victorian psyche. They were terrified. They had read Accum's Death in the Pot. They had seen the blacklists in the Lancet. They knew that their daily ritual was a game of Russian roulette. Horniman realized that in a marketplace defined by poison, the most valuable commodity was not flavor, but trust. He didn't just sell tea, he sold the absence of fear. His innovation was the packeted tea. It seems banal to us now, living in a world of hermetically sealed plastic, but in the mid-19th century, it was a radical disruption of the retail model. Horniman stopped selling loose leaves to grocers. Instead, he built a factory where machines, not men, weighed the tea. These machines deposited the leaves into packets lined with lead foil. The packets were then glued shut and sealed. The packet was a fortress. The lead foil lining, ironically the same metal that lined the poisoned chests, but here used as a barrier, kept the moisture out and the aroma in. But more importantly, it kept the grocer out. A shopkeeper could not cut Horniman's tea with slow leaves or sand without breaking the seal. The packet transferred the custody of the tea directly from the importer to the consumer, rendering the grocer nothing more than a middleman, a vending machine for a sealed product he could not alter. To drive this point home, Horniman turned the packet into a legal document. Every single package bore his signature. It was a personal guarantee, a Quaker's oath printed in ink, promising that the contents were pure tea, with no mineral or vegetable adulteration. The signature replaced the handshake. It told the consumer, "Do not trust the man standing in front of you with the scoop. Trust the man whose name is on this packet." The grocers, naturally, hated it. They refused to stock Horniman's tea. They called it ready-made rubbish. Their anger was not about quality. It was about economics. The open bin allowed them to blend cheap, adulterated teas with expensive ones to widen their profit margins. The sealed packet destroyed their ability to manipulate the product. It imposed a standard price and a standard quality that they could not tamper with. Horniman fought back by bypassing the traditional tea dealers entirely. He sold his tea through chemists, confectioners, and booksellers, tradesmen who were used to selling sealed goods and had no vested interest in the smooch trade. The public, tired of grit in their sugar and copper in their cups, flocked to the packet. The visual and tactile experience of buying tea changed. Instead of watching a man shovel a dusty pile of leaves onto a brass scale, the customer was handed a dense, heavy, rectangular brick. It felt solid. It felt industrial. It felt safe. The crackle of the foil as you cut open a packet of Horniman's became the sound of safety. By 1880, Horniman was selling 5 million packets a year. He had proven that the best way to stop a poisoner was not to arrest him, but to make his trade technologically impossible. The packet had sanitized the supply chain, but it had also done something else. It had prepared the British palate for the final phase of the story, the arrival of the industrial giants who would buy the very soil the tea grew on. Horniman proved that the packet could secure the tea, but he was still, at his core, a merchant. He bought his leaves from the market, and while he tested them for purity, he was still subject to the whims of the auction house and the integrity of the importer. The final step in sanitizing the British cup required a man who did not just want to seal the product, He wanted to own the dirt it grew on. It required an ambition that moved beyond the grocery shop and into the realm of imperial conquest. Enter Thomas Lipton. Lipton was a Scotsman, a Glasgow grocer with a flair for the theatrical and a mind for logistics that bordered on the obsessive. He looked at the tea trade of the late 19th century and saw a chain of custody that was too long, too expensive, and too dark. Between the tea bush in the east and the teapot in the west, there were too many hands. There were the growers, the curing houses, the local agents, the shippers, the insurers, the London wholesalers, the blenders, and the retailers. Every pair of hands that touched the chest added a penny to the cost and a potential grain of sand to the mix. Lipton's solution was radical transparency through total ownership. In 1890, he boarded a ship for Ceylon, modern-day Sri Lanka. He arrived at a moment of agricultural apocalypse. The island's coffee industry, which had been its economic backbone, had been wiped out by a fungal disease known as coffee rust. The plantations were bankrupt, the equipment was rusting, and the land was going cheap. Where others saw ruin, Lipton saw the future of the British breakfast. He bought the estates. He did not buy a few acres, he bought the horizon. He planted tea where the coffee had died. By doing so, he created the first truly vertically integrated tea company in history. There were no hongs to negotiate with. There were no mysterious Chinese warehouses where Prussian blue could be rubbed into the leaves. There were no London middlemen to mix in the sweepings of the warehouse floor. The tea was planted by Lipton, plucked by Lipton, cured by Lipton, packed by Lipton, and sold in Lipton's shops. He coined a slogan that appeared on omnibuses and billboards across Great Britain: direct from the tea garden to the teapot. It was a marketing line, yes, but it was also a statement of logistical fact. It promised the consumer that the dark corners of the trade had been illuminated. There was no space left in the supply chain for the adulterator to hide. But Lipton's greatest contribution to the death of the smooch industry was not purity, it was price. Because he controlled every step of the process, and because he operated at an industrial scale that dwarfed his competitors, he could sell tea at a price that was previously unimaginable. He democratized the leaf. Before Lipton, tea was a luxury that the poor had to stretch with water or buy from dodgy backstreet vendors who cut it with willow leaves. Adulteration was a crime of poverty. It existed because the real thing was too expensive for the working class to consume in the quantities they desired. Lipton flooded the market with the yellow label. By the late 1890s, he was selling 1 million packets a week. It was strong, it was consistent, and above all, it was cheap. He made genuine tea affordable to the very scullery maids who had once spent their mornings boiling lead-laced water. The economic incentive for fraud collapsed. The smooch factories in London closed their doors, not because the police raided them, but because the market destroyed them. It was no longer profitable to pay children to strip leaves from hawthorn hedges and dry them on copper plates when you could buy a pound of genuine imperial Ceylon tea for a few pennies. The era of the poisoned cup did not end with a bang, or a mass arrest, or a single court case. It ended because the industrial machine made purity more profitable than poison. The grocer's scoop was replaced by the machine-sealed packet, and the mysterious, smoky, delicate teas of China were replaced by the standardized, tannic, brick-red brew of the British colonies. We had traded the romance and the risk of the ancient trade for the safety and the sameness of the corporation. The tea was finally safe to drink, but the cost of this safety was no longer paid by the consumer's liver. It was paid by the land and the labour of the empire itself. The packet of Lipton's tea sitting on the Edwardian table is a triumph of industrial hygiene. It contains no lead, no copper, no sheep's brains, and no sweepings from a London floor. The seal is unbroken, The leaf is uniform. But in solving the chemical problem of the tea trade, the Victorians did not eliminate the suffering inherent in the cup. They simply exported it. They moved the pain from the stomach of the consumer to the back of the producer.
To understand the true cost of this pure tea, we must look at the place where the packet begins. We must look at the tea garden. The very name is a piece of branding genius. A garden suggests a place of leisure, of nature, of gentle cultivation. The reality of a tea estate in Ceylon or Assam at the turn of the century was closer to an open-air factory. It was a landscape of rigorous, mathematical monoculture. The wild, chaotic biodiversity of the jungle was burned away and replaced by endless, manicured rows of Camellia sinensis, trimmed to a uniform waist height to maximize the efficiency of the human machine that harvested it. This was the green desert, and like any factory, it required a workforce that was cheap, obedient, and easily replaced. In China, the tea had been grown by independent peasant farmers who sold their surplus to the hongs. It was a decentralized, opaque system. In the British Empire, the system was centralized and absolute. The laborer did not own the land. They were owned by the system. To staff these massive estates, the British utilized the indenture system. They moved hundreds of thousands of Tamil workers from the famine-struck plains of southern India across the water to the highlands of Ceylon. These people were referred to by the administrative term coolies. They lived in lines, long barrack-like rows of corrugated iron and mud, often with poor sanitation and little privacy. They were entirely dependent on the estate for their food, their shelter, and their medical care. It was a total institution, a feudal fiefdom run by a white superintendent, the Perrier Dorai, who dispensed justice and wages from the bungalow on the hill. The work itself was a grueling test of endurance. We have spoken of the scullery maid's 6 a.m. start, but the plantation day began before dawn, in the cold mist of the high altitude. The pluckers, almost exclusively women because their fingers were deemed more nimble, walked the steep, slippery slopes of the estate. Their job was to pluck 2 leaves and a bud, the tenderest shoots, and toss them over their shoulder into a cane basket strapped to their backs. The sensory reality of this work was brutal. The tea bush is a dense, humid plant. It holds moisture. As the women moved through the rows, they were soaked to the skin by the dew and the rain. The damp undergrowth was a haven for leeches. It was a common, daily reality for a plucker to stop, scrape a blood-gorged leech off her ankle with a twig, and continue working without breaking rhythm. The basket, when full, weighed nearly 40 pounds. The strap that held it passed across the forehead, digging into the skull, compressing the neck muscles, and the quota was relentless. A plucker had to harvest roughly 40 to 50 pounds of green leaf a day to earn her wage. If she fell short, her pay was docked. If she picked coarse leaf, older, tougher leaves, to make up the weight, the kangani, or overseer, would discard her catch and force her to start again. It was a system of surveillance as tight as any prison. Once the leaf was plucked, it entered the factory. This was a multi-story structure of corrugated iron, filled with the roar of machinery and the smell of warm, fermenting vegetation. Here, the art of tea-making was erased by the engine. The leaves were withered in massive lofts where giant fans sucked the moisture out of them. They were dropped down chutes into rolling machines, heavy brass and iron tables that crushed the cells of the leaf, mimicking the action of the hand, but with the force of a locomotive. This was the source of Lipton's consistency. The machine did not get tired. The machine did not add copper dust to the mix, because the machine did not need to fake the color. The color came from the controlled oxidation, timed to the minute. The result was a product that was chemically pure, chemically predictable, and chemically safe. So, when you drink that cup of pure tea, you are drinking a paradox. You are safe from the poison of the adulterator, but you are consuming the product of a system that broke bodies in a different way.
The Victorian drinker had traded the risk of immediate toxicity for the certainty of imperial exploitation. The lead was gone from the water, but the iron had entered the soul of the trade. The secret ingredient was no longer arsenic, it was the invisible, crushing weight of the plantation system. And as we sit here, looking at the bottom of the cup, we have to ask ourselves, is the aftertaste any less bitter? We stand now at the end of the Victorian age, looking back at the kitchen from the safety of the 21st century. We like to tell ourselves that we have left the era of the poisoned cup behind. We believe that the science of Dr.
Hassel and the laws of 1875 banished the spectre of adulteration forever. We trust the brightly lit aisles of our supermarkets, the hermetically sealed plastic, and the ingredient lists printed in reassuringly small fonts. We assume that because our tea does not contain lead paint and our milk does not contain embalming fluid, the war is over. But the ghost of the Victorian grocer still haunts the shelves. The specific poisons have changed. We no longer use arsenic to colour our sweets because dead customers are bad for repeat business. But the fundamental logic of the smooch manufacturer remains the operating principle of the global food trade. The drive to substitute the expensive with the cheap, the authentic with the mimic, and the complex with the simple is as powerful today as it was in 1850. Consider the honey in your cupboard. It is the modern equivalent of the Victorian tea leaf. It is a premium natural product, difficult to harvest, and subject to the whims of nature. And just like the tea of the 19th century, the demand for it vastly outstrips the supply. There is more Manuka honey sold in the world each year than is actually produced by all the bees in New Zealand. The difference is made up with rice syrup, beet sugar, and chemical flavouring. It is the lie tea of our generation, a golden syrup that looks like the truth, but is structurally a lie. Look at the olive oil, the liquid gold of the Mediterranean. Investigations routinely find that extra virgin bottles are often cut with cheap sunflower oil and coloured with chlorophyll to mimic the fresh press of the olive. It is the exact same psychological trick as the Prussian blue used to face the green tea. The fraud relies on the consumer's desire for a visual marker of quality, the deep green, the golden hue, and exploits it with a chemical substitute. The legacy of the 1875 Sale of Food and Drugs Act is not that it stopped fraud, it is that it forced fraud to become invisible. The Victorian adulterator was a crude alchemist, mixing sand into sugar with a shovel. The modern food fraudster is a biochemist, designing syrups that pass the isotopic tests of the regulator. The game of cat and mouse that began with Frederick Acum and his test tubes continues today in high-tech laboratories, where mass spectrometers hunt for the molecular signature of adulteration. But there is another, subtler ghost that remains. In our quest for safety, we have paid a price in sensory experience. The industrialization of tea that Lipton pioneered, the vertical integration, the machine rolling, the standardization, did indeed kill the poison, but it also killed the wildness. The tea we drink today is safe, consistent, and chemically pure. It tastes exactly the same in London as it does in New York or Tokyo. We have lost the highs of the trade along with the lows. We have lost the infinite, chaotic variety of the small Chinese farms, the specific terroir of a single hillside in Fujian that might have produced a tea with notes of orchid and smoke. We traded that complexity for the reliable, flat, tannic punch of the industrial tea bag. We accepted a world where nothing will kill us, but nothing will surprise us. The wild taste of the past, with all its risks and all its depth, has been paved over by the safety of the blend. We are no longer drinking the landscape, we are drinking the brand. So, here we are. The kettle has boiled, the cup is empty, the journey is done.
We have travelled a great distance in this single cup of tea. We started in the humid, musty Godowns of Canton, where the air smelled of spices and river mud. We sailed across the ocean in the dark, damp hold of a clipper ship, listening to the wood creak and smelling the bilge water seep into the chests. We walked the fog-choked streets of Victorian London, past the smooch factories where children stripped the leaves from the ash trees, and into the grocer's shop where the sand was mixed with the sugar. We stood in the freezing scullery at 6 in the morning, watching the maid's red, cracked hands shovel coal into the range. We watched her pump the water from the lead cistern, a liquid heavy with the invisible weight of the pipes. We saw the milkman whisk the brains of a sheep into the water to fake the cream, and we saw the confectioner roll the arsenic into the green sweet. It has been a grim affair. A tour of a kitchen that was less a place of nourishment and more a trap for the unwary. But you have survived it. You have navigated the minefield of the Victorian table. You understand now that the ritual of tea, which looks so elegant in the period dramas, the clinking china, the silver spoons, the polite conversation, was built on a foundation of industrial filth and chemical deception. History is often taught as a list of dates and battles. It is the story of kings and acts of parliament. But the true history of the human experience is found in the physical reality of the body. It is the taste of the copper on the tongue. It is the grit of the silica between the teeth. It is the tremor in the hand caused by the lead accumulating in the nerves. It is the slow death that comes not from a sword, but from the spoon. The next time you brew a cup of tea, take a moment to look at the dark liquid swirling in the china. Appreciate the fact that it is just tea. Appreciate the boredom of its safety. It is a luxury that your ancestors would have paid a fortune for. They drank risk. You drink certainty. The fire in the range has burned down to embers. The scullery maid has finally gone to her rest in the attic. The grocer has closed his ledger, and the chemist has put away his microscope. The house is quiet. The poison has been drained away, leaving only the memory of the taste. Rest well, and may your cup be empty of everything but the leaf.